Welcome everybody to this modeling talk. I'd love to introduce Marcel Binz, who's been working on modeling human cognition at the far more detailed neural level, and actually kind of, to me, it rhymes to the way people analyze large language model neural networks as opposed to human ones, which is interesting. Yeah, welcome, Marcel.
Welcome everyone. Thanks for inviting me. So I'll talk a bit about some old work, some new work. The title of the talk is Finding the Core of Human Cognition, Minimal Computational Model. So I'm a cognitive scientist, which means I'm interested in the question, what the hell is going on in the human mind? And before I can get to that, let me take a step back and talk about how we typically approach this question in our field. More often than not, we're interested in one particular domain or one particular aspect of human cognition. Say, for example, we are interested in how people make decisions. We then design a behavioral experiment, collect some data, how humans behave in this particular domain. And finally, we analyze the data that we have observed. And that can be, for example, done using computational models or using other kind of techniques. And each individual study typically looks at just a singular domain, but across our field, this happens in many different areas of human cognition. We study how people deliberate, how they explore, how they engage in causal reasoning, and many other things. So this kind of research paradigm gives us a really good understanding how human cognition works on this middle layer here, on the level of the individual experiments that we are conducting. But what we don't really get at is how this knowledge that we accumulate in this process of doing science translates to the higher layer that we are ultimately interested in, right? We want to know how do people make decisions in general and not how they do this in this very specific and maybe little odd situation. And furthermore, we pretty much have no idea of how this knowledge that we accumulate translates between all of these different domains on the upper layer here. So I think a situation we would much rather like to find ourselves in looks something like this, where we have a unified computational model that can capture all of human cognition jointly within a single architecture. I call these models foundation models of human cognition, in analogy, obviously, to the foundation models that have become popular in the machine learning community in the recent years. And if we would have access to such a model, that would allow us to make much more robust and much more generalizable claims on how the human mind works. Now, this is obviously not a new idea to psychology. It has been around for many decades already. So, for example, Alan Newell already said in 1990 that we really need these unified theories of cognition because they are ultimately the only way of how we can bring this wonderful and increasing fund of knowledge that we have under intellectual control. Now, he made the statements in machine learning years, what is by now an eternity ago, in 1990, probably put these words onto paper even before I was born. But we as a field, we haven't really made so much progress towards these unified theories that Newell is outlining here in the 36 years since, really raising the question, what is holding us back? Now, it turns out that we have recently seen the emergence of a class of computational systems that could be, at least to some extent, considered generalist agents. Of course, I'm talking about large language models, or LLMs here. So these are, as you probably all know, huge neural networks trained on vast amount of data taken from the internet to predict the next word in a given text sequence. But as we scaled up these models in the recent years, we found out that they have many emergent abilities that go far beyond merely predicting the next word in a given text sequence. Modern language models can, for example, translate between languages. They can write computer code for you or they solve challenging reasoning problems. So what these models can do qualitatively feels quite different from just predicting the next word in a given text sequence. And really, these are the first kind of computational systems that we have here that really have this kind of human-like ability that you can pretty much take any task, throw it at them, and you will get some kind of meaningful answer back. And this obviously caught my interest. And a bit more than 4 years ago by now, started to wonder whether it's possible to take some of these models, place them into a psychology lab and run psychological experiments on them. Now, if this would be possible, that would be quite a powerful approach for one to understand how these machines operate, how they make decisions, how they integrate information, and so on. But who knows, maybe by studying these systems from a psychological perspective, we would find out that we have already our hands at one of these foundation models of human cognition that I was outlining earlier. So we summarize. Oh, there's a slide missing. Well, anyway, we summarized our results in a paper called Using Cognitive Psychology to Understand GPT-3. There we took back then the most powerful model out there, GPT-3, and we subjected it to a battery of canonical tasks coming from the literature. So these cover domains like decision-making, learning, reasoning, and many others. So I won't have the time to go over all of the results in detail today, but I want to kind of show one example to illustrate how this approach looks like, because that will set the stage nicely for the actual main part of the talk. So one of the first behavioral paradigms that we looked at from psychology literature was the so-called two-step task. It's really one of the most canonical paradigms that we find in all of cognitive psychology, neuroscience, to study human reinforcement learning. In particular, the task is designed to disentangle whether people engage in model-based or model-free reinforcement learning. Details don't matter so much. Really, what is important is that people typically start in one of two states here. On the upper part, these are these two green rectangles. In each state, in the beginning, they have the choice between two actions, the pink action and the blue action. These probabilistically lead to one of two second stage states. And there, people have the choice between actions again and get probabilistic reward feedback. Now, in order to run this task on a language model like GPT-3, we translated it into a text-based version, right? People get this in visual form in the browser, but language models, at least back then, didn't really have this ability. So we translated everything in a text-based version. The prompts that we designed for this contained essentially all the information that human subjects get as well when they come into the lab and do the study. So starting with a brief description of the problem at hand. So here it says you will travel to foreign planets and search for treasures. When you visit a planet, you can choose an alien to trade with. The chances of getting treasures from these aliens changes slowly over time. And now your goal is to maximize the number of treasures that you get. We also give the model a summary of all previous interactions it had with this task. So in this case, this boiled down to a list of previous transitions, where each item essentially contained where have you been at a particular point in time, what did you do, where did you end up, and how much reward did you obtain. And finally, we asked the model, well, given that you're in a current situation, and this cover story here, that you're on one of these two planets, what do you want to do next? And the language model, like GPT-3, then responds to this question simply by completing the prompt that's shown here. In this case, answering that it either wants to trade with alien D or alien F. So we took this task, simulated on GPT-3, and then analyzed the results in exactly the same way that a psychologist would analyze human data when people do this experiment. And here, the slide order got a bit messed up. So essentially what we found is that GPT-3 performed quite well in many of these tasks, even outperforming human subjects in many of them. And this is, back then, that was really surprising to us, because GPT-3 was really the first computational model that really had this ability, that you could just take about any task from the literature, translate it to this text-based format, and then actually give reasonable responses. Nowadays, this is much more accepted, but really back then, it was almost mind-blowing for us to see that a computational model could have this ability. One notable exception that we found was the causal reasoning paradigm that we investigated, and I come back to that in a second. But then, when we investigated a bit more closely how GPT-3 actually solved these kind of problems, we found that its behavior quite strikingly diverged from how people solve these kind of tasks. And in particular, found the biggest divergences in the cases of exploration and causal reasoning. And I think to some extent that makes sense, at least if you want to come up with a post-hoc explanation. Exploration and causal reasoning are two types of domains that place a very strong emphasis on actively interacting with your environment, whereas large language models like GPT-3 are just trained to passively predict the next word in a given text sequence. And this kind of mismatch between training objective and what is required by the task at hand might also, at least to some extent, explain why we observe the biggest divergences in these two areas. So initially here in this study, we did this on 4 experiments, but by now we have extended this quite a lot. We have recently conducted a large-scale international collaboration in which we have collected hundreds of different tasks and then evaluated not only one model, but a series of models. And we wanted to find out what kind of properties of a model makes it aligned to human behavior and which one makes it less aligned to human behavior. And we found that this divergence to human behavior actually gets amplified by almost any kind of post-training techniques. So if you do instruction tuning, fine-tuning for reasoning, vision fine-tuning, and so on, all of this makes models less aligned to human behavior. We also found in the preprint that this effect actually gets bigger in the newer models, where presumably the post-training techniques have become more sophisticated over time, override kind of the knowledge that is about human cognition that is present in these base models. So this leads me to the next question. How can we actually get one of these foundation models of human cognition that I talked about in the beginning, right? We've seen that large language models out of the box, they produce always interesting behavior. They have this very human-like characteristics that they can produce interesting behavior across many tasks, but it doesn't always fully align with human behavior. So luckily, we have access through decades of psychological research to an almost abundance of data sets of human behavior. The problem is they are not available in a unified format. So 2 years ago, we thought, well, let's gather some of these data sets, create a huge data set of psychological experiments, all in a unified text-based format that can be translated by language models, that can be processed by language models. And that led to a data set that we call Psych 101, which is the biggest resource of human psychological data in a single repository. It contains records of over 160 psychological experiments, over 60,000 individual participants, and these make over 10 million individual choices. The corresponding paper was recently published in Nature and was really an effort of a large-scale international collaborations. People from Princeton, MPI, Google DeepMind as well, NYU, Oxford, Cambridge, Technical University, Munich, and so on all contributed to this. The data in this data set that we've created looks something like this. So similar to what we have seen before, we first transcribe everything that a single participant has seen in a single session into a long text-based prompt. That includes instructions of the task. So here's an example where participants are presented with triplets of objects that are assigned to different keys. And then in each try, they have to indicate which of these objects is the odd one out. Then they see a triplet of objects, a boy, a burrito, and a cow. They get asked to choose one of these. In this case, the participant thought the burrito was the odd one of these odd one out object. And then that continues for many different tries until the end of the session is reached. We also mark human choices with these specific characters here. And this is useful because when we want to fine-tune models on these kind of human choices, we only want to fine-tune them to mimic human behavior, right? We don't want to fine-tune them to repeat all of the instructions and the stimuli and so on. So it's good to know where these human responses, what they correspond to.
So question of this,
yes.
Because just the example you have right now looks, well, kind of odd and unique that, some human decided that's the association. How heterogeneous are such responses among humans, and to what extent is this a model of humans versus a human?
Yeah, so it varies a lot by task. I think some of these tasks, different humans behave quite similarly. In others, there's a lot of individual differences between humans. Basically, what we do in this data set, we just put multiple humans, all the ones that did the experiments, into a single pot. We have identifiers for participants that can be used to distinguish which response did come from which participant, right? Obviously, all of this is anonymized. But essentially, at present, at least in the data, we don't really care whether how big the differences are between individuals in the task. A model could potentially pick up on these things, and we'll come back to that a bit later, maybe.
Got it. Thank you.
Perfect. So then we took this data set and wanted to fine-tune a language model on it in order to align human behavior. In particular, we started with the open source version of the Llama 3.1 model in the 70 billion parameter version. Applied a fine-tuning technique known as quantized low-rank adaptation, and that led to the first foundation model of human cognition that we call Centaur. We're really looking for a long time for a good name for the model. We wanted it to name some kind of combination between human and llama. Sadly, that doesn't exist, so we had to settle on some nearest neighbor, and that's then where the name Centaur came from. And then we wondered, well, how can Centaur predict the behavior of new unseen participants? So we first went ahead and implemented a collection of domain-specific cognitive model for each of the experiments that I'm showing here. So these models have been extensively used in the cognitive science literature to predict, capture, and explain human behavior in each of these individual domains. And I showed performance of a model based on log likelihoods of individual human responses, normalized with respect to these domain-specific cognitive models that I just talked about. So this is this gray dotted line here at 0. If we are to the right of this line, the model is better at predicting human behavior. than these domain-specific models. If we're to the left, it's worse. And we found that Centaur was in fact better at predicting human behavior than the domain-specific cognitive models in pretty much all of the experiments that we investigated. And I think that's quite exciting, right? It means we have access to a computational system here that within a unified architecture predicts human behavior really well, and it does so even better than the leading theories that you find in the literature. Can also repeat this analysis for the llama model. So without any fine-tuning, we see this model is actually also quite decent at predicting human behavior. Nevertheless, we see quite a substantial benefit of fine-tuning, really indicating that the pipeline that we set up here did what it was supposed to do.
So question about the fine-tuning process. So you took a regular llama and you simply fine-tuned it on those experiments, right?
So we simply fine-tuned it only on the human button presses, essentially, from these experiments, yes.
So then this, I think I'll ask this question again in a different guise later, but is there a way of capturing what the internal embedding representation is within the original llama as well as the modified Centaur and how they differ? Like, in what sense is thinking, I don't know if it's human-like, but I don't know, more predictive?
So we have explored analyzing the internal representations a bit, and definitely they change during this process of fine-tuning, but we haven't spent too much effort in this that I could show you nice plots or so. So there's definitely change happening. It would be very interesting to analyze what these changes imply, how they look, what the new structure is, and so on. And we recently started a project going a bit in this direction, but it's too early to present results on that yet.
Yeah, thank you.
So this is perhaps the most obvious thing we can do, right? These are all experiments that are part of the training data, but they were done by new participants here. So the amount of generalization is fairly limited. But in the paper, we then stress test Centaur on a series of increasingly complex out-of-distribution scenarios. We shown that it's robust to semantic changes in the underlying cover story, so we can change the framing of the underlying cover story to a different story, and we find that Centaur still produces human-like behavior even in unseen cover stories. We found it's also robust to structural modifications in the underlying problem. So in order to test this, we included a lot of two-arm-banded problems in the training data, where people have the choice between two options and they get reward feedback based on doing so. But we purposefully left out any three-arm-banded problems because we wanted to see whether Centaur can generalize under such structural modifications, and we found that it was indeed able to do so. We also found that it can generalize to completely novel experiments. In the original paper, we have shown this on roughly 10 new experiments that were not part of the training data in any shape or form. But by now, we have repeated these kind of analysis on hundreds of different experiments, found very strong generalization, even to completely unseen settings. We have also found, and this was really the most surprising thing that we report in the paper to me, we found that Centaur is not able to predict non-human behaviors. And that seems a bit odd at first, but it's actually quite important as well, because it really shows that the model is picking up on some kind of latent constructs that are important to human cognition, right? Cannot predict learn arbitrary things, but it really can only really learn things that humans can learn as well.
So when you say non-human, it sounds like you have a game theoretic opponents that are purely selfish. That's your non-human proxy.
For example, that is yes, basically. I think here this is a game theory experiment in this case, and we evaluate Centaur on human trajectories, on trajectories from agents with artificial agents with matched behavioral statistics, but purposefully not human-like, and we found that it cannot predict these as well.
Got it. Thank you.
We also found that the model could be applied to predict secondary measurements that was never explicitly trained for. So, for example, it can capture neural activity. We've shown this in a decoding analysis in the paper, and that it can also be used to predict human response times alongside human responses. I skipped all of these results quite quickly. If you're interested, I can encourage you to check out the paper for much more details. But really taking together all of these analyses cement Centaur's status as the first foundation model of human cognition, right? It's a model trained on broad data at scale that can be adapted to a wide range of downstream tasks. And that's really the definition of a foundation model. And at present, we essentially have a very powerful predictive system of human behavior. That's useful for many different situations where we want to simulate behavior from a human and use it for various purposes. For example, you can imagine simulating artificial participants in the lab without even running new experiments, conducting analysis on these participants, figuring out, hey, what are maybe interesting experiments to run on actual people, and thereby save a lot of time and money for prototyping and so on. But at present, Centaur is essentially really only a black box system, right? It doesn't really offer direct insights into how the human mind works. And this is, for me as a cognitive scientist, really the main motivation for developing these models. Now, the question is, how can we now go from these highly predictive models of human behavior to a model that can offer us actually mechanistic insights into how the human mind works across these many different experiments together? And the approach that I want to pitch for this kind of departs from how we typically study the human mind. In cognitive science, typically we study human behavior in each of these isolated domains, like these little Lego blocks that I'm showing here. We have one Lego block for decision-making, one for memory, one for learning, one for reasoning, and so on. And the hope in research was always, eventually, we'll be able to put all of these Lego blocks together, all of these individual components, and arrive at a comprehensive theory of the human mind. But that has not really happened so far. I want to turn this approach on its head, essentially start from the opposite direction, start from a raw building block, like the Centaur model, black box system that can already predict human behavior really well. And then step by step, I want to cast structure into this building block so that eventually we arrive at models that can not only predict human behavior well, but that also offer direct insights into how the human mind operates. So one question that one might ask in this context is, what is the minimal set of assumptions that we need to explain the majority of human cognition? How much can we compress the assumptions that go into a computational model so that it can still capture the majority of human behavior? So I want to make a proposal here and then investigate how well a model with these components will do in terms of capturing the human mind. I call this model the core model, kind of signifying that it's supposed to capture the core of human cognition. Based on a few simple principles, first, it does a phoneme-level processing. So it gets in a sequence of phonemes. For example, like in the data sets that we have previously seen, those transcription of the experiments translated on a phoneme level. Then the model tokenizes these, embeds these phonemes into a vector-based representations. Then the model has a simple Hebbian-like episodic memory. So it has a memory in the form of a matrix H, where it stores memories. In each time step, it has some entries that it wants to store in this memory. These are the value vectors here, V. And then it decides where to store these vectors in memory, and it does so based on some kind of keys K. And a simple Hebbian mechanism that is responsible for the storage. So essentially, you compute cross-correlation matrix between these entries and accumulate that over time in memory. The keys, so telling you where to store a current memory, is simply a function of the input. In this case here, we assume a linear function plus some kind of nonlinearity. And then there's also an association strength that tells you how much do you want to store something currently in memory. This is this beta that I sometimes refer to as learning rate as well. Again, this is a simple linear function of the input transformed by a sigmoid nonlinearity, squashing it between 0 and 1.
So from eyeballing, this looks like a simplified version of attention, but more
yes.
linear, like a single layer. Okay.
Essentially, this is a simple version of a linear attention mechanism, what we're seeing here as well. So it depends a bit where you would be coming from. In machine learning, this would probably be called linear attention. In, I guess, cognitive science literature, you would refer to this kind of heavy and episodic memory.
Got it.
So what is being stored in memory are essentially then prediction errors. So the model takes the current input X and then tries to recall for the current key, which it wants to store something under, what is there already in memory, computes the prediction error, and that is being stored in memory. This is essentially the same that in machine learning, some of these gated or data networks are doing. There's also a forgetting mechanism that's context dependent. So we assume that the memory ht-1 in each time step can decay. by a factor between 0 and 1. So 1 means no decay, 0 means completely erasing the memory. And how much that is happening is a function, again, of the input. Then we assume there's some selective output gate. So in each time step, we essentially decide we want to query our memory, extract some kind of values. And we do this by computing this input-dependent query vector. And then internally, the model will compute similarities between queries and keys and then retrieve a linear combination, similarity-weighted entries from the value matrix, from the memory matrix based on that. And that is furthermore controlled. What is given out as an output, which dimension? It's controlled by an output gate. Again, this is simple linear transformation of the input, transformed by sigma nonlinearity. And then in the final step, we assume that all of these computations are applied hierarchically. So everything here is one layer, and then we stack a bunch of these layers. These models, the model that I'm proposing here, has a lot of similarities to models in the machine learning literature, gated delta networks in particular. But each of these individual components is actually something that has been proposed in various cognitive models and models from cognitive neuroscience. So each of these components can be cognitively motivated. I think that is quite cool. And we really have only these components. We stack them on top of each other, so there are no multi-layer perceptrons in the middle like you would have in transformer-based models or something like that. And then we essentially want to see how well would a model with these simple assumptions, how well would that capture human behavior? So what we'll do is we fit these models to human choices. So here we are in a setting of essentially plain standard cognitive modeling. So there's no language-based tree training. We take this architecture, fit it on scratch from some kind of data. In this case here, we use an extended version of the Psych 101 dataset that I described earlier. So this course is called Psych 201. Particularly, we focus on a version with discrete choice options only. So only experiments where people press buttons. This amounts to a dataset of 176 psychological experiments and about 15 million individual human choices. And then we will evaluate the model based on two metrics. Let me start maybe with the second one. So this is just predictive negative log likelihood. So we essentially compute log likelihoods of individual choices on a held-out test set and use that as a measurement for human performance. We also use Bayesian model selection criteria in the form of negative log marginal likelihoods. So this is essentially a transformed version of the Bayesian model evidence, trades off goodness of fit against model complexity, and therefore implements a form of Occam's razor. And here in this case, we approximate this using simple Laplace approximation. So first results that I'm showing is, does actually stacking these individual components, does that help if we have multiple of these layers? Because that is something that traditional cognitive models typically don't do. So the plot here shows negative log marginal likelihoods in blue and negative predictive log likelihoods in red. And we see lower here means better. So the model is a better fit of human behavior. We see adding layers helps, and we see a ceiling is probably around 6 to 8 layers happening. For the predictive metric, it's a bit later. For the Bayesian metric, it's around 6, because this penalizes additional complexity that is added by the additional parameters in the 2 additional layers. Then we do a bunch of Laplacian analysis, looking at, is each of these components actually needed to capture human behavior well? So first, looking at negative log marginal likelihood, again, lower means better. We see that the full core model achieves a value of around 7.1 million. And then we remove each of these individual components. We remove prediction errors, store raw values instead. We remove phoneme-based processing and instead use standard byte pair encoding, like we would do with language models typically. We remove the forget gate and the output gate, and we see each of these components, if we remove them, actually makes the model worse at capturing human behavior, indicated by the increase in these metrics. We also compare against a bunch of baselines, a random model, obviously, that is quite bad at predicting human behavior, but also a standard transformer model or a gated delta network, and not as good at predicting human behavior in this metric. We'll also compare a Centaur model that I talked about earlier, but we can't compare this directly on negative log marginal likelihoods because it had been pre-trained on additional data, and it's a bit unclear how to make this a fair comparison with that kind of metric. But then we also look at predictive negative log likelihood on a holdout test set. And here we see a similar picture. So removing each of these components makes the model worse at predicting human behavior. We again significantly better than a random baseline model and a transformer model. In this case here, the gated delta network is slightly better than the core model at predicting human behavior, but really the difference is quite marginal. And what is perhaps really interesting is that the core model that we trained from scratch here on this large data set is actually better at predicting human behavior than the Centaur model it's a pre-trained model plus trained on a similar large-scale data set. So it's quite cool that we can train these models from scratch and get actually models that predict human behavior really well.
So question, your model looks a lot like a neural network, a large language model structurally, but with a bunch of simplifications.
Yes.
Let's take transformer, which is a lot like what you just showed. So what's the difference between transformer and your model?
Yes, I think what you said is exactly right. What we have taken is essentially a gated delta network and then removed a lot of the components that were unnecessary until the point where we essentially only were left with a set of cognitively meaningful components. So it is very similar to some of these gated data networks, let's say in particular.
Sorry, and so these models are, I guess, more sophisticated in terms of they have additional LLM-y things that are unnecessary for human cognition.
Exactly.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. So, I mean, all of the results were essentially performance-based metric, but being able to predict human behavior is not all there is to capturing human behavior. It's been, for example, argued nicely in Stefano Palmentari's paper called The Importance of Falsification in Computational Cognitive Modeling, where he says that in addition to just seeing how well a model predicts human behavior, we also have to simulate a fitted model and see how many actual behavioral effects does it reproduce when we do that. So we went ahead, extracted 41 different behavioral effects from the papers or from the experiments that were part of Psych 101. We implemented the analysis for these effects and the corresponding experimental simulators, ran the core model of these, and found that it reproduced around 73% of these behavioral effects contained in the data set. And I think that's quite cool, right? We have like this model with just 5 or 6 simple assumptions, and that's sufficient to capture around 75% of all of the findings that have been proposed in psychology. Maybe that's a bit of a strong statement, but if we were to scale up this a bit more, I think that would be quite a surprising finding to say, hey, even these simple assumptions, that's enough to explain 2/3, 3/4 of the findings that we have in psychology. Would be quite far-reaching, I think. Just to give some examples, I don't have the full list here, but I cherry-picked a few that I found interesting. We found, for example, that the core model exhibits temporal discounting. It has like this gain-loss asymmetry that you find in people, in particular in intertemporal choice tasks. Find that it weighs probabilities non-linearly, for example, in risky choice experiments. It learns more from positives than from negative prediction errors. So this is sometimes called an optimism bias in reinforcement learning. And it trades off reward against the policy complexity that's applied to get this kind of reward. This is sometimes known as policy compression. Equally interesting is what the model, or even more interesting probably, what the model can't do yet. In particular, we found that it's not able to show model-based learning, for example, as measured in the 2-step task that I've shown earlier, but also in other tasks, for example, multitask reinforcement learning settings. And that's perhaps not so surprising, right? Because if you recall the assumptions that went into this model, essentially nothing here, we didn't add any abilities for planning or model-based learning into the model. So that's perhaps one of the reasons why it consistently doesn't show these effects. Likewise, we found that the model doesn't rely on directed exploration. So directed exploration is a type of exploration where you take your uncertainty estimates about the world into account to decide how much you want to explore. And this is also something that we didn't find that the model would do. We can then also look at the individual parameters of the model, in particular the forgetting rate and the learning rate. So here, let me first look at the memory time scale. So this is essentially a transformed version of the forgetting rate, tells us how many time steps on average does a model remember things. And one detail that I left out earlier, each layer of these models, like in a transformer model, has individual heads as well. And we first look at, is there actually specialization in these individual heads for how many steps do they remember things? And we found that indeed to be the case. So for example, in layer 0, we found that some heads really remember only one token, whereas other heads remember quite a lot of tokens on average, up to over 2,000 here. There's also variability between layers. So we found some layers have very short memory timescale. For example, layer 1 here, it's only between 4 and 11 tokens memory timescale on average, while other layers, in particular the last one here, essentially have an infinite memory timescale. So they pretty much don't forget at all. We haven't related these yet to findings from the cognitive science literature, but I think it would be quite cool to do that to see if such a specialization and variability is also present in the human brain. Same for learning rate, right? Here we see similar pattern. There is a variability between the individual heads and also a variability between the individual layers. Some layers have very high learning rates, other layers have fairly low learning rate, like the layer 2 here, for example. We can also
So question.
Yes.
Do you have a notion of it learning concepts? Because you're describing it's having trouble with like model-based learning and so on. So conceptual, it sounds like it's a conceptualization kind of thing, which neural nets, LLMs are doing, but they have challenges with. And I'm not sure how your model performs there.
Yeah, so depends what you define by concepts. It would depend a bit, I think. So I'm trying to think if we have like experiments in the data set that would allow you to test these kind of things, but nothing comes to my mind immediately.
Well, for example, I have a vision model and I say which neurons light up for cat or face. That's a concept visually speaking.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have an equivalent in your case.
I don't think we have directly analysis that target a specific case in the data set, but I think that would be something that definitely could be analyzed post-hoc by doing some additional, more sophisticated mechanistic interpretability on the model. So is there something like compositionality, for example, emerging in the model might be an interesting question.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you.
So we also look how do these parameters that I've just shown you evolve over time. And for this, I took many experiments which correspond to multiple subgames. And then I plot on the x-axis the relative position in the subgame as a fraction of the total game. And on the y-axis, I plot the corresponding parameter. So this could be, for example, an experiment where people play multiple 2-arm bandit tasks in a row, let's say. And what we see here at the boundaries between these games, that the memory timescale goes down, in many cases quite drastically. And I think that makes a lot of sense because these are typically resets where you can forget everything about the game or most of the things about the game that happened previously. You're now starting completely fresh with a new set of game parameters and you have to do the task again. In these cases, you would expect that the memory timescale would go down, these boundaries. Same for learning rate, we find across these games, learning rate goes slowly down, and this is something that we see in a lot of cognitive models. In particular, Kalman filtering and the Bayesian approaches have all these characteristics that learning rate go down as you get more information, as your uncertainty becomes lower, you simply also learn slower. It's something that we also find in the model here. And all of these are really initial attempts to characterize the internal mechanisms of the model a bit more precisely and figure out what is going on in it, kind of relating it to known findings from the literature, but I'm really hoping that we can expand this to much more sophisticated mechanistic interpretability analysis, analyzing latent states, how they evolve over time, how they cluster, and things like that. So you might also ask, is this a truly minimal set of assumptions that we have encoded here? And the answer is likely not, right? We have seen that the model can't capture all of the effects, so there's certainly room for improvement. We have tried a few things that didn't help. So for example, we added a semantic memory in the style of some cognitive models, in this case, the context maintenance and retrieval model. We added a channel-wise forgetting decay, like for example, you see in some of these Kimi delta attention models recently. And we tried also decoupling the write and erase computations in the model. This is something, for example, that data networks 2 are doing, but we found none of these components really helped at significantly predicting human behavior better. So to wrap things up, I think we're now at a time where we have all the ingredients to work towards a unified theory of cognition, right? We have access to large-scale data sets, we have the computational architectures that can do this, and we have the compute to actually fit and train these models. So everything is there. So I think completely new time for the field to work on these theories. Quite exciting, I would say. The core model that I presented is our first step towards such one theory. I think there are many other approaches that make sense as well. And particularly in the case of the core models, a lot of interesting directions to explore. For example, planning, think about something like loop transformers and things like that, adding uncertainty to the model, obviously integrating vision, integrating individual differences, and many others. So with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators for all the help in these projects. Thank you for your attention and happy to take additional questions.
Yes, well, thank you very much. So one thing to ask is modalities. So the way to connect this to reality, I was thinking two directions. One down to neuroscience, the other one is to behavioral science, right? So let's focus on neuroscience. At some point in the middle, you alluded to brain scans and its ability to predict brain scans. To what extent can you align these physical measurements to the behavior of your simplified core model?
Yeah, so for the core model, we haven't done any of these analyses yet. We have done them with the Centaur model, and then we found fine-tuning the model purely on behavioral data also makes it more similar to human neural data. And I guess that is a finding that you find in many similar papers that look at the setting in a more task-specific way. So I would assume, without having done any of these analyses, that to some extent at least we can link neural recordings to activities in the core model specifically as well. But we haven't done this yet. This is all ongoing work, so most of it not published, at least for the last part that I presented.
So you haven't done it, but let's dive into the possibility. Yeah. One thing that comes to mind if you were to do that is one, it's predictive. Like it is predictive in neural phenomena, which is what you've done. The other direction is something like JEPA, where you say, however you embed neural activity and psychological stuff, it better be a same embedding. Otherwise, it's not physically meaningful. So to what extent is that an opportunity to take diverse observations that should map to the same place, actually forcing it?
I think you can definitely do this. I'm trying to think if there has been work done in this direction, and I think probably I know some stuff where, for example, people try to align language models to neural activity, and they found that this also changed their behavior in the ways you would expect them to change, so become also more human-like in terms of producing behavior. And I think similar technique could be applied here. I think the tricky part would be that neural data is even more messy than the behavioral data, right? Like if you think back, like a lot of these projects where we created these large-scale data sets, these involve collaborations of up to 100 people. So this was a lot of work just creating the data. And I think in the neuroscience world, this is even more of a mess to work with that kind of data. But I think it can be done. I think especially now a lot of these workloads can be offloaded to agentic pipelines and so on. So I think really the bottleneck there is having really the neural data at scale. And we don't have that yet, but I think it is possible to create it.
If I can make this messier, I was also intrigued by what people look like syndromes of like psychiatric diseases, where you say that you go from like this point in the I don't know, I didn't call it embedding space, but I think it is embedding space to that point, and that is psychosis, or what's called schizophrenia or something. Yeah. These are very long time frame things that are sparse, but they appear to be extremely rich in terms of like true, maybe even emotional state. To what extent is that a reach goal here?
Definitely. I think one of the, I think this is a super valuable direction of research. I think a lot of things, what you find in papers that are doing this, that this works quite well in the particular setting that you investigate, but that it doesn't generalize at all to even a slightly different setting. So you found maybe a correlation in your particular experiment, but often that doesn't even correlate to a experiment from the same domain. But I think similar approaches could be applied here, and the hope is obviously because we have trained these models jointly on so many different data sets that the findings you get from such analysis are much more robust. But it is definitely the goal to run this analysis, yes.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of more LLM tasks. So you've been focusing on experiments that are choices.
Yes.
Is there an opportunity to be more conversational kinds of tasks? Talk like a human talk, but more meaningfully than online text, which is what we typically get.
Yes, definitely. So I think the next step, obviously, for me is kind of to take these models. We kind of shown, okay, they work well on these artificial lab experiments. But now, because they are essentially stimulus computable, right, they can operate on any kind of natural language text. You can apply them to any kind of setting, including much more naturalistic setting. And for example, people having conversations, right? So kind of then the goal would be, hey, can we fit these models to human conversational data and kind of figure out for once what kind of information processing is even going on as two people have a conversation, like, for example, the one that we are having right now. And then obviously there's also a huge practical use case, having humans that having models that can converse in human-like ways. I think the amount of applications you could imagine is almost endless.
So what is I guess we're more used to LLM training, just throw it in random text. How does the text change when it's a psychological experiment? Should I be thinking like you run through a virtual world and make decisions? Is it psychiatric analysis because there's these very targeted questions? Yeah, what should we be thinking of?
But both in principle. I think the data set that we have here are really these kind of cognitive experiments targeted at cognitive processes. So not necessarily questionnaires, but really something like this, right? You get shown a bunch of stimuli, you have to make a decision. You get a series of observations, you have to make a judgment about the next observation. You get a series of input-output pairs, and you have to classify the next output pair. You get shown a sequence of letters, and you have to memorize and recall them. So these kind of things you can imagine that we currently have. But obviously, human behavior is much richer, right? There's a lot of other human behavior. For example, people having conversation, people writing stuff, and kind of things. So in the long run, the goal would be definitely to gather all of these together.
Got it. And now one hole you're pointing to is conceptualization, planning, that kind of stuff. So as a computer scientist, my first response is, yeah, shove RL at it, because that just allows you to have forecasting, which feels a bit broken because you're just imposing RL onto a brain. But to what extent is that can it be done naturally, where it's a multi-turn kind of thinking we do? We can forecast into the future. So what's a kind of a neural realistic way of capturing forecasting?
Yeah, I mean, that is a good question. You could imagine, for example, if you think about, let's say, the equations that are presented in the core model, that you add some kind of temporal difference learning into these equations, right? So right now, the model stores prediction errors between current inputs and what is in memory. But you could imagine something that is more like a temporal difference error that looks not only at the immediate next step, but looks multiple steps in the future. That would be one way of doing this. Obviously, planning, right? Capabilities for planning, integrating that into the model, for simulating futures and kind of reason about rollouts and so on is another way. So I think there's many different ways. And people have investigated some of these in domain-specific cognitive models as well.
Makes sense. Now, once you have these agents, the one obvious application is creating societies out of them. And people are doing this, I think, much more with regular LLMs.
Yeah.
But then I guess what's working, what's not working, and to what extent can these kinds of variants of models help?
Yeah, so I think what you really see, and I mean, I really went over this quite quickly. We had this recent preprint showing that post-training actually makes language models less human-like, right? And this is even more strong in the newer models because they have better post-training techniques. And in our paper, we have shown that this is the case for these models producing human-like behavior. But you find this also in text, right? Even if you think about models like GPT-4o, people love this model because it produced really human-like language, and people complain nowadays, for example, how alien, let's say, Opus 5 is talking to them. So you really see this in practice as well, that like the newer models, because they went through more post-training, become less good as simulators of even producing human language. And I think there's a huge opportunity here for thinking hard a bit about how do we actually get models that can still follow instructions while being able to mimic language that is produced by people, even if you just think from an economics perspective, right? People love talking. I really love talking to models like GPT-4o. Like when a model went down, people complained. I actually got a letter from a group of people in Japan telling me how much they identified with this model, and that it felt much more emotionally connected when talking to us. So yeah, there's a lot, I think, to be done in that context still.
So then, if my goal was modeling the economy, like it's narrow but huge, there I want to kind of rational, not rational, realistic economic decision making. But I don't care about the text realization. It's the decision making. I guess what do I take a LLM that's and fine tune it for that purpose? Do I take something like Core, which is more human-like, but I mean simpler? It has other trade-offs. I guess what's a way for some of these social simulations?
I think for these social simulations, I guess in many cases, your goal is really predicting human behavior well, right? And not necessarily understanding. And I think that the best approach is really take a LLM that is already quite good at it, fine-tuning it on the space of data that you're interested in. So if you have a space of data that you're interested in having people having conversations or so, fine-tune it on that, right? I think really that is the approach. If your goal is prediction, then I wouldn't do something like, for example, the stuff that I presented with the core model. That's really targeted more at what are the mechanisms that are happening inside the human mind.
Well, that's actually my question. Is a simpler targeted model more appropriate for realistic behavior prediction, or the more complicated, what's called Centaur kind of model, or that family of approaches?
It's a good question. I think if you would ask 100 people, you would get 100 different answers. I think my answer is probably if your goal is really prediction and you have data that you can use to train the model better to make better prediction in this context, to act as a bidder simulator, probably you should just use a black box model.
Okay, that makes sense. And then I guess going in the future, I guess where do you see this going? Because I'm noticing in your work, I mean, if you started with Llama as a foundation, you can keep going in that direction. There's also the stuff where you're using leading theories and actually chaining them up into this sequence and have a lot of layers of that. But there's only so many theories out there. So at some point in time, you're going to mine out domain theories, and then you have to be, well, I'm not sure, copying the brain or training a lot more data. What's the opportunity?
I think two things here, right? I think first of all, extending the mechanisms. So I think these are really the maybe 5 or 6 most obvious ones one could think of, but I think there's many more to explore. And there is also a gap of experimental effects that we can't explain yet, right? So there's more to do in that space. Then there's obviously more to do other modalities, right? Visual data, individual differences are things, right? At the moment, we fit one model for all participants, but obviously, you know, people are different, they behave differently. So somehow we have to figure out how do we integrate that in these kind of models. But in the long run, I really see applying these kind of models to really understand human behavior in much more realistic situations. Try to use them to understand human behavior in the real world, right? The end goal would be something like, can we have a cognitive model that tells us about the mechanisms that are going on in the human mind as a human does pretty much any task that they can do on a computer? What happens in your mind as you write code? What happens in your mind as you search for a new phone online and things like that?
Got it. Well, yeah, thank you very much. It was fascinating.
Thanks a lot for inviting me.